different ways, and some people are already being arrested for that, because I mean, just the fact that Lieberman was selected to be Israel's foreign minister says volumes about the current situation, because I don't think anyone in Israel really believes that Lieberman is qualified to present Israel's case to the international community. But when Lieberman comes to the UN and says to the UN, like he did, that there is no chance for peace, he's not saying it to the UN, he's saying it to his own audience back home. It's just pure populism, and it's complete collapse of any kind of coherent strategy.
Matthew?
Yeah, you made a couple of glancing references to apartheid towards the end of your talk. I wondered what you think about the analogy with apartheid, whether it's seriously analytical or is it more like propaganda?
Well, I recommend reading Ben White's new book about this analogy. I think you can look at it from different ways. And one fact that I'd like to put out there is that in the area which I call Palestine, which has just one government and one army with any kind of authority, Palestinian Authority doesn't have any actual sovereignty, only one sovereign government. 49% of the population are Jews. 49% of the population are Palestinians, and 2% are others. But the political system is based in such a way that Jews have 78% of the votes for parliament. So the Zionist governments have, Zionist parties have an automatic majority. And Palestinians have just no chance of competing in the political sphere. So you can say, okay, maybe this is apartheid. But even more so, I would say, there is that the meaning of the word apartheid in Afrikaans is separation. In Hebrew, hafrada. And hafrada, or separation, is outspokenly and very openly Israel's policy towards the Palestinians. Very openly. As a Jewish citizen of Israel, I'm not allowed to marry Palestinian. I will not be allowed to marry a Palestinian, not even a Palestinian citizen of Israel. The wall of separation is known as the wall of separation because it is intended to separate between Israelis and Palestinians. And there are also smaller walls of separation within Israeli cities between Arab neighborhoods and Jewish neighborhoods. So this policy of separation is, in fact, apartheid. There are a lot of differences with South Africa, and there is a very interesting debate going on. What are the differences? What are the similarities? But in fact, a group of lawyers, human rights lawyers from South Africa recently came up with a very comprehensive report comparing the two regimes, and they did come to the conclusion that what Israel is doing should be considered apartheid. And they have some experience in the matter.
Okay. I'll start with this young lady there in purple.
I wanted to ask you to go back to the cost of the occupation, because you went a bit on how it was profitable, but then why is Israel still occupying if it is not profitable at the moment? I do not understand. So
Yeah. Well, you've noticed that I skipped that part because I think it's one of the more difficult aspects to explain in a short time, and I did dedicate quite a large part of the book to try to answer this fascinating question. But I think you have to look at it through different groups within the Israeli society and why these different groups support the occupation. And obviously there are the weapon companies, the manufacturers, they have every reason to support the occupation, but they are not the main force. The main force are actually lower class Jews, people who have an immediate economic interest to end the occupation. But they don't, and instead they support the occupation and the right-wing parties. And they don't do that because they're stupid. The Zionist left often tries to make the point that the problem is that the populist right wing can always get support from the stupid lower class people who don't know what's good for them. And I don't think this is any useful explanation at all. I think for a lot of lower class Israeli Jews, they understand that their class identity puts them at the bottom of society, whether there's an occupation or whether there isn't. But their national identity can put them at the top and the winning side of the story, and therefore they try to put more focus on that. And as long as the Palestinians are mistreated, at least they're not at the bottom. At least there's someone that they can look down to. And you can see that with the soldier at the checkpoint. Often these soldiers standing at the checkpoints come from lower socioeconomic classes in Israel. And often they know perfectly well that after they're released from military service, they're they might be unemployed or at least be in a very low-paying job. But while they're in the checkpoint, their word is God, and they can determine life and death of the people around them. And unfortunately, many of them exploit this power.
The guy in green. You.
Can you just briefly touch on your perception of how
Jews were traditionally against Zionism, because if you think about it, just what is the idea of Zionism? It is a rather peculiar idea. It means that if you have a group of people who are persecuted, and of course Jews were indeed persecuted in Europe, and no one's denying that, would it seem reasonable to you that this group would set up a movement and a leadership whose main goal is to just pack their bags and leave? That was what the anti-Semites were saying. Let's get all the Jews out of Europe, and that's what the Zionists were saying. Let's get all the Jews out of Europe. So that's a bit odd, and most Jewish communities did not see the same way. Unfortunately, many of these communities were wiped out in the Holocaust, but still there was always a strong Jewish opposition to Zionism. I think with the Israeli military successes, especially in 1967, Israel was able to win over many of these Jewish communities to see Israel as a kind of David against Goliath, and a very heroic image, and they became more supportive of Israel. But now I think we see the trend going in the other way. And I hear all the time of more Jewish communities, whether in Europe or in North America, who are joining BDS. And they don't do that because they're self-hating Jews, as some as the Israeli Foreign Office would like to say, but because they refuse to be identified and represented by Israel, and they refuse to allow this idea that unfortunately is spreading, that Judaism manifests itself through violence. This is an anti-Semitic idea, and unfortunately Israel is promoting this idea, and a lot of Jews are quite appalled by it.
Okay. Everybody will get a chance to speak, I think. There's no problem at all. I've forgotten your name now, and I know it well. The guy in blue.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that Jewish Israeli citizens are very few are sort of what in occupation they can, because they're invested in the benefits of colonialism, and if it ended tomorrow, then they might change their minds. But then I was also interested in, much earlier on, you talked about that there wasn't necessarily a tangible conspiracy to prevent the aid getting through. That in the end it came down to individuals being destructive. So that means that there's the overall mindset of officials, Israeli officials, is it's for the Palestinians, let's bugger it up. So is there room for manoeuvre there to try to change people's minds?
Well, one thing that I often find that I need to explain to audiences that are not too familiar with the Israeli society is that Israel is a very decentralized form of government compared to most countries in the world, in fact. And part of the fact that Israel was formed from a British colony by also presenting itself as creating a narrative of an anti-colonialist state, anti-imperialist state. The idea was that bureaucracy is to be frowned upon. Israel does not have a constitution, and in fact more power and authority is concentrated in the lower ranks of government than and the army as well than in most countries. A lot of the policies that are adopted by the Israeli army are actually initiatives by very low-ranking officers, or even soldiers that are not officers, that just make up their mind, and their commanders encourage that. So this is something that was intended by the first leaders of Israel, in order to keep Israel not as a normal state but as a kind of movement, was a project where everyone feels that they're part of this project, and they're taking part of it by being expected to act on the national greater good as individuals. But Israel is also a very multicultural society, and a lot of groups that have been traditionally multicultural in practice, not necessarily the various groups receive fair treatment by the government, but a lot of the groups that were completely denied the right to speak up and participate in the political process, like Mizrahim Jews, the Jews that come from Arab countries, and they are almost half of the Jewish population now in Israel. They were completely decentralized and marginalized from the decision-making process. When they were gradually making headway in joining the political process, they also came into this decentralized system that gave them, those of them who were able to get positions of authority, a lot of leeway and a lot of freedom, but they were not part of the same project exactly. And they had somewhat different goals. And the end result is that currently the Israeli government is completely paralyzed, because every small group and every small faction just are heading in their own direction and with their own strategy, but there is no coherent strategy and there is no coordination.
Okay. You? I'm sorry, don't know your name.
Given the right of return, what determines this right of return? Is it religion or ethnicity? What I'm saying is that a blonde, blue-eyed atheist from Russia who says his great-aunt Annie was Jewish, how is he entitled to this return when a Palestinian who's a Semite is denied that?
Okay, well, let's clarify just the terms, because when you say right of return, that is usually the term that Palestinians use to refer to the Palestinian refugees who were deported in 1948. And Israel legislated the law of return. The law of return is supposed to grant every Jew in the world the right to become an Israeli citizen. It's quite easy, actually, for Jews from all over the world to just come to Israel, give some evidence that they're indeed Jewish, and if that evidence is accepted, they will get an Israeli passport. Now, the law of return, you ask how is it justified? It is justified by the original plan of Zionism, which was, let us create a safe haven for Jews, because Jews cannot be safe in Europe. And instead of fighting for the rights of Jews to be equal citizens in Europe and be safe in Europe, we are instead going to create a new kind of ghetto for them in Palestine, where they would be safe in that ghetto. And for that purpose, they argued that every Jew should have the option to become a citizen in that country. The problem with this is that the plan failed, and today Israel is probably the most dangerous place for Jews, while Jewish communities in other countries are more protected from persecution based on being Jews than the Jews who live in Israel. Persecution, I mean, no persecution. Even the Jewish community in Iran is probably safer, unless, of course, Israel bombs Iran, which is a different story. So in a way, the law of return seems to be very outdated. And Israel now could be seen as part of the problem and definitely part of the solution of anti-Semitism.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Andy to ask his question, but also to say